Hi everyone, just a quick note before we get started. JJ and I didn't have access to our usual equipment when we recorded today's interview, so the audio is a little choppy in some spots, but we hope and suspect that the quality of the interview will make up for that, and we hope you enjoy.
Greetings, friends, and welcome back to the podcast of Jewish Ideas, a Torah in Motion production. I'm JJ Kimchi. Here on the podcast of Jewish Ideas, we are in the middle of a three-part series on the intellectual history of Chabad Hasidut, analyzing its central ideas and principles from its inception all the way to the present. Chabad philosophy intersects with many important ideas and trends of the modern era, and we are very excited to discuss these ideas in depth with our erudite guests. We are also excited that this series is being sponsored by Rabbi Gary Huber in appreciation of keeping thoughtful discussion of Jewish ideas as a central task of Jewish life today. We are very grateful for his contribution and thank him in turn for his services to the Jewish people. Today we will be turning our attention to the leader of Chabad Lubavitch between 1892 and 1920. His name was Sholom Dovber Schneersohn, and he was the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe. Also known by his acronym, the Rashab, he led his movement through some perilous times, including World War I, and established Chabad's network of yeshivot, which continue to function to this day. Like other Chabad leaders, the Rashab was also an ideological trailblazer, opening up avenues of thought previously unexplored in Jewish philosophy. Over the past year, elements of Rashab's thought have been brought to the attention of the academic world for the first time through the labors of Dr. Reuven Leigh, who is an affiliated lecturer at the Faculty of Divinity at the University of Cambridge, as well as the director of Chabad at Cambridge University. His book, The Philosophy of Rabbi Sholom Dovber Schneersohn, Language, Gender and Mysticism, was published in 2023 by Bloomsbury Academic, and it is a pleasure to have Dr. Leigh with us today on the podcast of Jewish Ideas. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
Excellent. So let's dive in to this period and to this thinker. Situate us a little bit historically here. What are the times we're talking about? What is going on in the world, in the Jewish world, and specifically in the world of Lubavitch during the period of the fifth Rebbe?
So the Rebbe Rashab was born in 1860, and before I get into some of the historical context and the situation which he found himself in and the ideas that he developed, I think it's important to start off with a recognition that the very answering of such a question is itself creating an intellectual framework of thinking about him. So many times we try to shoehorn different people and different ideas into an existing framework of thinking, which can be a sort of linear logic, whereby we see a causality such that they're born in this period, they interacted with these ideas, and therefore we can appreciate the development of their thought. One of the things we're undoubtedly going to get onto is the way Chabad Hasidut in general, but definitely in the Rebbe Rashab's thought, turns a lot of these assumptions on their head and questions how causality happens. What is affecting what? What is the sort of the interaction? What is the intersubjectivity of people, places, and ideas, which don't always follow in what might be considered a general Western academic tradition of following the history of intellectual thought. I can talk all day about the history of the Rebbe Rashab and enjoy it very much, but I think it's important that when we discuss this, we're sort of acknowledging that we're already defining what we're talking about before it's been defined to us. It's a certain imposition of an intellectual framework. So the Rebbe Rashab was born in 1860 in the town of Lubavitch. So he is a grandson of the then Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel, known as the Tzemach Tzedek, and his father, Rabbi Shmuel, was the youngest of the Tzemach Tzedek's 7 sons. And as such, was seen as quite distant maybe from the leadership ambitions that maybe were, you could associate with the older brothers. He himself was also not the oldest son of his father. So he was a second son, and actually really a third son, but an older brother passed away in infancy. So as a young boy, it may not have identified so much as being sort of the heir apparent of this great Hasidus. In the time of the Tzemach Tzedek, Chabad was very successful, if you might say. The court was dominant throughout Russia and Eastern Europe, and the Tzemach Tzedek had 7 sons, so there was a future to talk of, and his sons themselves were very prominent, very able people. At the young age of around 5, his grandfather passes away, and at that moment, a tremendous rupture happens in the world of Chabad. And there's a dispute between the brothers about who is going to assume the leadership. And many of them assume leadership at the same time, but in different places. And his father the Rashab's father, Rebbe Shmuel, who became known as the Rebbe Maharash, he assumed the leadership in the town of Lubavitch. So this is where we have the sort of the definitions of Chabad Lubavitch, and then Chabad Kapust, Chabad Niezhin, and where the other brothers set up their courts in different parts of Eastern Europe. So he grows up with his father being the Rebbe in Lubavitch, but still he's a very young boy. But as he develops, he becomes very adept at listening to his father's talks, and we have extant over 300 manuscripts of his own transcripts of his father's lectures and talks. I think he started at the age of 12 already assuming the position and the role of being what we call a chayzer, a repeater, and a transcriber of his father's talks. He marries quite young, marries his cousin, but then his father passes away relatively young. His father dies at the age of 48. This is in the year 1882, and he's now only 21 years old. His older brother is just 24, or turning 24, I think, and they're left with this sort of fledgling community called Chabad Lubavitch. His uncles, who are much older and much more prominent, maybe in some respects, they had flourishing centers in Kapust and Niezhin and Liadi, in lots of different places. And there was a serious question mark about would Chabad Lubavitch actually be able to perpetuate itself. There were some prominent Hasidim who were supporting the young men who were entrusted now to continue the work of their father, but it was a very uncertain time, to say the least. And obviously the competing courts saw this as an opportunity to take advantage, and there was quite a bit of skullduggery and difficult internal politics at the time. But together with his brother, they tried to hold the court together. They both taught, lecturing, giving sermons, not writing too much at that time, and trying to organize the court in some form or other. But it was definitely an uncertain time. In 1892, you described that his leadership started in 1892. He only officially accepted, or sort of, it might even be a bit later, 1893, where his brother moves away from Lubavitch. His older brother moves away, and he's left responsible for the whole project. And that is when he really assumes the position. He sits in his father's place. He accepts people into private audience called Yechidus. And so he's becoming much more willing to identify as the Rebbe of Chabad Lubavitch. And here he starts writing a lot more, teaching a lot more. And that, you could say that people had a lot more confidence then. He was already in his early 30s. The situation had organized itself, let us say. So then we move forward a little bit towards the end of the 19th century. And his only son, who later became his successor, the Frierdiker Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, sometimes known as the Rebbe Rayatz, he got married in 1897. And at the wedding, it was announced that they're going to open a yeshiva. Now, in Chabad, there wasn't really this, unlike in the yeshiva world, which had sort of had a head start of maybe just under 100 years, with the famous yeshivas in Volozhin, etc. In Lubavitch, there wasn't really a yeshiva as such. People came to learn. There were, as a tradition known as zitzers, people used to come and sit for months on end in the Beis Medrash there and learn, but there wasn't really an organized system of learning for young Bachrim with a curriculum, with a staff, with a faculty, or anything like that. And he decided that he was going to open a yeshiva, and this is known as the Yeshivas Tomchei Temimim, which he took a couple of years before he gave it its name. And there they originally drew some of the brightest and the best that they could muster. It was a quite difficult yeshiva to get into, but over the years it expanded to become much more inclusive and younger age Bachrim, even all the way down to Bar Mitzvah and earlier. And it became a serious project. And that really defined so much of what then came afterwards. Because the Rebbe Rashab saw himself in many ways as the communicator of Chabad knowledge and ideas to these groups of Bachrim that eventually studied in the yeshiva. And his works then became much more consistent, and there was just a an expansion of the ideas to such an extent that it had never been seen before in Chabad circles, that level of expression of Hasidic ideas, both in their depth and their breadth. In 1915, during the First World War, he had to leave Lubavitch to the advancing German armies, and that ended the over 100-year relationship of Chabad to the town of Lubavitch. And he eventually made his way southwards towards the city of Rostov-on-Don, where he lived out the rest of his life, and ultimately is buried there as well, passing away in 1920. So that's just a brief summary of his trajectory.
Interesting. Setting the stage again, let's try and paint a bit of a general intellectual biography of the man. So, as you say, he wrote a lot, and a lot of his stuff is either he wrote or is transcribed. So what can we say, broadly speaking, about his intellectual biography? What was he interested in? What were the main ideas that he considered over and over again? Were there certain themes that he came back to, that he sought to expand?
Okay, so if we think about him intellectually, let's first consider what was his mode of sort of expression of his ideas. Start sort of at the end, and then we'll maybe work backwards into sort of how they were configured. The primary tool of communication for not just him, but all of the Chabad Rebbes was what we call the deliverance of a maimah, plural maimarim, these oral sermons, which were more than a lecture, more than a shir. They were a sort of a spiritual encounter, and treated, in the jargon of within Chabad Hasidut, it's often referred to with the abbreviation of Dalet Aleph Ches Tach, Divrei Elokim Chaim. And so you have this like the words of the living God. And it was seen as at the moment of delivering the Maimah, there was a way in which the Rebbe was communicating the divine wisdom. And a Maimah was always treated with tremendous reverence. All those in attendance would stand at the moment of the delivering of the Maimah, and it was taken extremely seriously. But that's not to take away from the fact that it was also channeled and maybe funneled through the particular Rebbe. So each Rebbe had their own style, their own mode of communication. Just like you might say that the Book of Devarim, for example, being the Mishnah Torah, being the words of Moshe, but they're the word of God through Moshe, through the funnel, through the channel, through the vision, through the prism of a Moshe Rabbeinu. So each Rebbe we see very distinct styles and methods of communication and ideas. The Rebbe Rashab would often deliver his discourses on a Friday night. So by contrast, the Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneersohn, would deliver them mainly on a daytime, like a Shabbos afternoon. But everyone had these different times when they did it. And if we want to just sort of pick out the different styles, because it might be interesting to draw out what the Rebbe Rashab was doing. So besides for the Alter Rebbe, so the Alter Rebbe, I know you have another podcast about the Alter Rebbe didn't write a tremendous amount. He mainly just spoke, and other people transcribed what he said. However, from the Mittler Rebbe onwards, the Mittler Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, the Rebbe Marash, the Rebbe Rashab, and the Frierdiker Rebbe, they were very into writing down their Maimarim before they delivered them. Not always, but very often they would write out a draft, but more than a draft, quite a complete draft of what they intended to say at this moment when they were going to deliver the Maimah. When they then delivered the Maimah, there would be a group of trusted students who had a tremendous ability of memory and capacity to grasp the concepts. And what they would do is they would together work through memorizing and remembering what was said. And they would then go into the Rebbe Rashab and be able to repeat it to him. So they'd repeat back to him what he had said, and he would correct them and pick up on certain points. And occasionally they would have questions, he would answer them. And there would be this back and forth between sort of the editorial team and the Rebbe. After that, the Rebbe himself would write his own notes on the original text that he had written, and he'd send that to the scribe, who would compile a sort of collate all of the additional notes that had come as a result of delivering and result of consulting into a sort of a final piece. And that would be copied and copied and copied and sent out to as many of the Hasidic communities as was possible. So that was the main mode of communication of ideas. The original manuscripts were generally never seen. They were held as a sort of a private copy. It's only in sort of later generations, when the Lubavitcher Rebbe republished all of these Maimorim in books, he gave the original manuscripts, which were in the library, to the editorial teams, and they were able to produce a much more accurate copy and transcription of the Maimah. Now, this wasn't the only form. So the Rebbe Rashab he wrote specific works that were just a written form work. These are usually smaller pamphlets, known as Contrasim. There were 4 or 5 of them over the span of his leadership. And then he had his own personal reshimas, his own notes, and he kept those to himself. But thankfully, due to various different means, those have now been published as well. So we have the contents of his own private notes, which obviously stylistically are quite different from the oral teachings that he gave. Now, what was he talking about? What are the ideas that we find in these Maimorim? So the core objective of his work is a deep, systematic compilation of the entirety of Chabad thought. This is one of the reasons why his was referred to during his lifetime by one of the Hasidim as the Maimonides of Hasidus. So similar to Maimonides, who would took the vast and unwieldy sections of the Talmud with ideas here and ideas there, and difficult to see a coherent sort of full picture. He was able to codify it, classify it, and clearly get to the nub of the issue that was being discussed across multiple pages of the Talmud, and also throughout the Tshuvas of the Gaonim and the response of the Gaonim. So similarly, the Rebbe Rashab had all of the manuscripts of his father, grandfather, great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather, all the way back to the Alter Rebbe, and he saw to it to cultivate a very systematic and clear depiction of all of many, if not all of the ideas of Chabad thought, to the point where he sort of overtook all of the earlier material because it just surpasses it in clarity. And so it's often useful to go back to the earlier sources to see what he was doing and how he was adapting it. But for the initiate of Chabad thought, the Rebbe Rashab's teachings are so much more accessible and clearer and available to the person. In order to be able to develop ideas so fully, he really did excel in a model of teaching which we call the Hemshech. Now, the Hemshech is a series of Maimorim. So we go back to the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe would give one-off Maimorim. Each Maimor was an individual unit. Obviously, there would be overlapping ideas across different Maimorim, but when he delivered the Maimor, it would be a complete unit in and of itself. Now, occasionally, even in the time of the Alter Rebbe, you already have a series where he was sort of the next week, he would say, to understand what we discussed above, and he'll go into a further exploration. So he'll develop the idea further. But that usually is 1 or 2 or 3 Maimorim total. That you see also with the Mittler Rebbe, his son, and also with the Tzemach Tzedek, his grandson. So they would have this sort of sometimes expanding the idea a little bit more. In the time of the Rebbe Rashab's father, Rebbe Manash, he developed this idea, the Hemshech. Very, very long, extensive explorations of a topic. And again, he would write the whole thing beforehand. So he'd write hundreds of pages of what was intended to be delivered. And then he would slice it up, because the audience were only never going to listen to, 45 minutes to an hour, just like your podcast probably. You can't expect people to listen to 2-3 hours of discussion. So this is what they would do. They would slice it up, and they would add beginnings and ends to make it sort of topical for the moment, at the time they were delivering it, because it would go over a year or so, sometimes half a year. It depends how long the tract was. And in that way, communicate a bigger idea, like sort of being able to give the idea a little bit more space to breathe. So although his father was already doing this, the perfection of the style and the model was very much in the hands of the Rebbe Rashab. And so we have a number of Hemshechim, a number of these series where he gives a full accounting of a particular idea in Hasidic thought. My book was on a particular, what we might call a small Hemshech of only 8 discourses, only 8 Maimorim from 1898. But he did a very large piece in 1905 that stretched all the way till 1908 for 2.5 years. It's known as Hemshech Samach Vav, Tafresh Samach Vav, 1905-1908, so 5666. And then he went he outdid himself even more in the year 1912, which is a hemshech called Hemshech Ayin Beis, Tofresh Ayin Beis, started Shavuos in 1912, and that took him all the way to 1916, and is a massive work. And it allows the reader to really engage with ideas in a slower pace, a deeper space, and with much more clarity than was possible if you're trying to squeeze all the ideas into a 45-minute sermon.
And so aside from being a collator and an expresser of ideas in such a manner that can allow them to marinate slowly and allow them to gather all the sources and take you through all the steps from A to Z, I mean, are there specific themes within prior Chabad thought that he decided were worthy? I mean, to ask in a very crass manner, like what were the topics of these 3 or 4 year long disquisitions?
Right. Okay. So the topics of Chabad Hasidut in general are the nature of God, the nature of the world, and the nature of a person. And then in all of them, their relationship to each other. And included within that is obviously also the matter of the Torah and the matter of mitzvahs. Those are the topic headings, I would say, of Chabad Hasidut. And one of the areas where we find throughout the Rebbe Rashab's Hasidus is an ability to appreciate. Oftentimes a text is trying to advocate for the primacy, the importance of one particular thing over another. And what we see in the Rebbe Rashab is a constant going backwards and forwards between, the primacy of mitzvahs over the primacy of Limud Torah. I mean, we have all this already in the Gemara, like what is greater, Talmud or Maisa? This going backwards and forward. And then in the self, what is greater, a person's ratzon or a person's tainug? And the grappling of these themes. So what we get with the Rebbe Rashab very often is when all of these interrelated topics and themes come into discussion, he gives us the opportunity to see the richness in sort of the full range of the topic, such that even if in a particular hemshech he's going to be advocating for maybe the greater prominence or importance of one thing over the other, and that's his focus at that moment, it doesn't preclude him returning to it later and reconsidering. And it's this to and fro that you see in his text often, about where you feel like he's fully convinced you about the primacy or the importance and the centrality of a particular idea. He'll then, in the next week, undo the whole everything he just built and start again from a different premise. And I think many people experience, when they study this text, a tremendous intellectual curiosity and an intellectual openness to the possibility of an idea. So each idea is really never put to bed. It always stays fresh and is vibrant in the way it can always be reutilized and reconsidered. There's a very common sort of refrain that people who in the world of studying in Chassidus Chabad, that when we're talking about different things, there'll be people ask a question, the response will be, well, es wenn sich wumeret. It all depends from what perspective you're talking about. So this idea of a relativity of ideas and how ideas are only really conceptually meaningful as they relate to other ideas is a sort of a methodology that you see so brilliantly, in my opinion, used in the Rebbe Rashab's Maimarim, that every idea can only be appreciated in its context and its relationship with other ideas. And instead of that becoming what some people accuse of sort of a more relativizing approach, is it sort of just deletes, it dampens, it diminishes the impact. Something has to be absolutely the only one way of thinking about it, and that's how it holds itself together. Instead, what happens is all ideas, it's like all the boats get lifted as the sea rises. And there's a sense of wonderment about how the ideas can be so rich in a new vein. And you always know around the corner there could be another hurdle which is going to redefine the way you think about this idea. And that's why you keep reading. I mean, it goes on for 2 years, but it's compelling. It's a very compelling way of teaching. But it's important to also appreciate that it's within the broader context of Torah. So the Rebbe Rashab, in his own sort of learning, we have from his son a sort of a depiction of his sort of schedule of learning. He was very obviously proficient in the usual things that you'd expect of Talmud, of Poskim, and very much so Medrash. Medrash has a very strong presence in Chabad thought in general, starting with the Alter Rebbe. And there's sort of a sense in which the Medrash is a sort of a prototype of Hasidus. It's an inner dimension, an inner layer. It's a way of perceiving the Torah from a very distinctive dimension. And continuously in Chabad thought, we find this usage of Medrash to explain and connect ideas. And it was said that Rabbi Shab would study the Medrash Rebbe, the whole Medrash Rebbe every year. He would do a sort of like we have Daf Yomi or Rambam Yomi today, he would have his Medrash Yomi and make sure to ensure that he finished and was up to, like they were fresh in his mind, all of these Midrashim, and they're used very significantly in his teachings.
So, this is an excellent segue to the set of lectures, a set of mamarim that you focus on in your book that you published last year, very specifically on a set of lectures given in 1898, in which you claim that the Rebbe the Rashab, among other things, set out to, if I may distill it down, to essentially explain but also disrupt sets of ideas that traditionally are given in, let's say, a binary form or hierarchically binary form, and essentially destabilize and complicate these. So I want to ask, the first set of these, I suppose, is a certain philosophy of language, a certain idea of how language and speech operates. And so I guess the question I want to ask is, how did he set this out? How did he set the table of what the conventional, traditional idea of what language and speech and the relationship between the two? And then how did he seek to upend this? And then I suppose to what effect? Meaning, why? What is the advantage of this different perspective on these matters?
Right. So I'm going to start with the why. What was his objective at all? He states very clearly in the text that his objective is to inspire his audience to a greater commitment to learning Torah and doing mitzvahs. Surprise, surprise. That was his function. That was what he was trying to. He wasn't a philosopher in the sense of he thought he had an interesting idea to share, and let's just talk about it. There was an agenda, a very clear agenda, and at the core of it is appreciating. And I think this does, in its context, like thinking about in the context of the Alter Rebbe, one of the core objectives of Chabad thought is to appreciate the profundity of the performance of physical mitzvahs. The performance of a physical mitzvah is a key subject matter and a key locus of attention of trying to appreciate, why does it matter? Why does God want us to take material items and perform actions with those things? There is a perception or an assumption that comes with a hierarchy of heaven and earth. And what this seems to do is it places the earth at a very central part of the project. The point of existence is not to escape. The point of existence is not to, although some in Jewish circles might say it's to sort of attain an olam haba, to attain a spiritual bliss and an escapism from the world. In Chabad thought, there's a sort of a central question about why is actually everything otherwise. And this question is asked in multiple ways. Why in the first place did God create a material world? That is sort of the starting question of the 1905 series. And in this Hamshach, the Rabbi Shab wants to bring out why performing a physical mitzvah is truly the most meaningful, purposeful, understandable thing that you could ever do. And instead of it being that we need to come with our conceptualizations and infuse meaning into our actions. So a lot of religious discourse is that, well, we have to bring it down to earth, but it's really the mind and the kavanah that is defining this action. If there's no kavanah, then it's as if it doesn't exist. Instead, what the Rebbe Shab wants to do is discover how actually it's through the action and the performance that we are able to have kavanah. Kavanah is a result. The causality over here is not the kavanah defines the act, but rather the act defines the kavanah and the intentionality of the act. So this is sort of the bigger project. The bigger project of the Hemshech is to appreciate that, and then to appreciate it across a whole range of relevant issues, salient issues, such as the importance of the body. And we're going to see the importance of women, the importance of mitzvahs in Torah, the importance of people vis-a-vis the Torah. He exposes a whole bunch of relationships whereby conventionally, historically, both Jewish and non-Jewish, we find that there's a privileging, a sensing that to be the giver in this hierarchy, what we call the mashpia, the person who is providing in any given hierarchy, is to be the dominant, the most important. So he starts off in this discussion about speech, that speech in relation to consciousness. So our consciousness, in our minds, we'll have an idea, we'll think things through, and then ultimately we might communicate those ideas. So that in the conventional approach, we might assume, in say a philosophy of mind, that the purest or the most absolute pristine form of the idea that a person may have will be as it is constructed in their mind. And the function of reducing that to words, to a communication, is a diminishing of the pristine nature of that idea. The idea is going to become contained. You can never really communicate the depth of your understanding to another person. And so there's a certain frustration with speech. Speech is sort of holding us back from having true communication, because we can't telepathically understand what the other one's thinking. And so what they get is a sort of a morsel, a very small definition of what is really going on in the teacher's mind. And he builds this up quite convincingly. This is how you would think. This is how it's assumed. This is how we think of it. But practically speaking, everyone knows that as soon as they start speaking about an idea, lights start going on in a person's head. Ideas start linking. You start thinking about, that can relate to another idea. As long as it was on your own head, very often it's only can go so far. But in the act of sharing, the act of communicating, we develop a sort of so it's like a catalyst of a renewed and a refreshed sense of that idea that we're trying to grapple with. And he says like, this should be impossible. If speech is merely a reduction of what was already in a person's mind, a remnant of what was already in the head, so how is it possible that in this act of speaking, there is this sort of revolution of thought that happens in a person? And this leads him to argue that in the physicality and the expressiveness of the letters of speech, the in a way nonsensible, onomatopoeic expressions is something much more profound than was in the original idea. That a person at their very core identifies much more deeply with the letters of speech than they do with the ideas that they generate. And so when they start speaking, their very self, the thing that itself generated the idea in the first place, becomes enthused, becomes triggered to be more expressive. And that's sort of how he constructs his theory of language and speech, and the importance it has. When you learn Torah, you're supposed to speak the Torah. Through the speaking of it, it's going to enhance your understanding of the Torah. Similarly, when davening, you're supposed to say it out loud. Sometimes there's even permission on the high holidays to say parts of davening out loud. Usually we wouldn't, and we'd consider that to be haughty to daven so out loud. But at that moment, we need to arouse a deeper sense of kavanah, and kol ma'oreh hakavanah, the articulation and the forcefulness of our speaking out the words of prayer, are going to deepen our kavanah, and that is because of this sort of virtuous loop that happens when we speak. That it takes us back to our core identity as selves, and therefore we're able to generate a deeper sense of the idea that was previously of a limited scale.
So I'm curious about this primacy of speech over thought, actually, because this kind of idea could be interpreted, I suppose, more psychologically or more metaphysically, in the sense that you could say, as you said before, that one of the good things about speech is that, by bringing it outwards, by articulating a set of ideas, you have to define them through words. You have to, trap them, as it were. You have to put them in a certain order and express them in a certain way, and that leads to a certain purification or refinement of the ideas themselves. Or is the claim being made something more, I'd say, I don't know, metaphysical, like in the very act of speaking, apart from its practical effects, apart from practically articulation and speaking helps to define things. No, but there's something about the very act of speech, in its very act of speaking, that is superior or preferred or something else. Meaning, is there something deeper than simply speech is helpful for the construction of ideas?
Yes, indeed. The argument would be that it's actually an ontological primacy. That if we want to understand the self, the starting point would be in our capacity to be a medaber. The rabbinic term to refer to the human is not so much the maskil, the intellectual, but more the medaber, the speaker. And going back to the translation of Onkelos, when he wants us to understand what it means, the soul that is infused into Adam HaRishon, the Nefesh Chai is called a Ruach Mamalalo. It's this spirit of words. And what the words, and we'll get onto it in a second, but what why is that? Why words? Why letters so identifiable with the self? And they have an ontological primacy. They precede in the self a intellectual configurations. And so the intellectual configurations are a result of the causation here is that because we have letters, because we have self, we have to construct ideas which will then ultimately then play out in real letters, not just conceptual letters, not just soul letters, but actually spoken words that then exteriorize the person. The person becomes externalized and in connection and in relation with another, that the fullness of the person is fulfilled. Now, what is about the letters? Like, what is it? Are we talking a metaphor? Are they actually sort of letters that sort of are running around somewhere deep in our souls? The concept of a letter in the Kabbalistic, I think also back already in the Medrash, we talk about letters as being like bricks. There's a certain inanimate clod of earth element to a letter. Letter is just a letter. With a letter, you can build houses. With bricks, two letters build so many houses, etc. And so, in a way, the letters, because they are devoid of all expressiveness, they are sort of a non-entity. They lack presence. They lack expression. They actually exude a certain absence, a lack of anything. There is no function of these letters outside of the consciousness that infuses them with sensibility. And it's that absolute devoidness of expression, of impulse even, that identifies it with the very core of the self. Because if we want to trace sort of like this theology of the soul that we find in Chabad Hasidut, it talks about an etzem echad poshut, a very simple, undefinable, simple essence. Forgive the word essence. There's no really good word to define the Chabad notion of etzem, but this essential self is undefinable, uncharacterizable, and also unmotivated, unconnected to anything other. It just is. It's something that we have to perceive of as a thing in and of itself. It's not in contrast. It'd be contrasted with something which would be a gilui, an expression, a revelation, which is always in relation to something else. And etzem is sort of just alone, just the thing itself. So if we look at the self, the expressive self, everything else that we have, our intellect, our emotional sides, are all trying to express something to something else. They're always in relation to things. But there's a part of us which is just has a certain absence, a certain stasis, a certain lack of motion to it. And we see that in the letters and the words of speech, but more broadly in the body itself. So anything that is so pristinely still and non-expressive automatically becomes resonant to the very essence of the self. So it becomes a sort of, there's an expression, nods tchilatan besofan. The beginning is rooted in the end. And so you have the fullness of the person from the very depths of the soul to the very externality of the body, are the most aligned conceptually parts of the self. And in between, we have this whole processing. And it's about appreciating what is going on in this processing. So instead of starting off with, I think, therefore I am, the cogito is the starting point, and intellectualization is the sort of the beginning of the self. Chabad Hasidut and the 1898 Maimorim are deeply invested in recognizing something prior to that and something past that. And in that, we get to a sort of a deeper and a better appreciation of what it means to think, what it means to have ideas, how we can enhance our ideas. If we get stuck in this sort of what you might call logocentric and in some ways arrogant primacy of the rational and intellectual, we limit the possibilities of the rational and intellectual. Because the rational and intellectual in that phase of perception is always going to be quite defined and specific. But if we open it up to the possibility of what Levinas might call the infinity of the other, the capacity for be outside of that boxed intellectual realm, then intellectualism can itself flourish in untold ways.
Interesting. Okay, let's move to another part of that series of lectures, which you draw attention to another a binary position, which the Rebbe the Rashab seems to upend or at least complicate it in significant ways, which is that of gender, that of the relationship between men and women. So could you, once again, before just set the table on how such a relationship, such a hierarchical relationship is normally understood, let's say, in Jewish thought or in philosophical thought in general, and then what did the Rashab attempt to do to this? And again, why?
So it probably doesn't need too much explaining about the history of sort of a patriarchal perception of gender, one that preserves a strong dualism between male and female, that preserves a strong hierarchy between male and female, and associates all of the pristine and desirable qualities of rationality, of nobility, of straightness, and all the other qualities you might wish to acquire with men and not with women. And incidentally, that includes the mind, the consciousness, intellect, and speech. Women obviously denigrated for speaking more than men. It says in the Gemara, "Asar kabim shel sicha yarda la'elam, v'tisha not la'hanashim." So right, there were 10 portions of speech that came to the world, and the women took 9 of them. So this sense of the parallels. So we started off with consciousness and speech, then we went to soul and the body, and then we moved to male and female, and it fits consistently into this similar framework. And even within Chabad thought, even though these ideas find expression in places here and there, they are never developed to their fullest and nowhere near with as much attention as we find in these 1898 sermons. A keen reader might be able to point to a reference in an earlier source to some of these ideas, but my argument is that none of the ideas have ever really been, all the dots have never really been joined up to the extent that they get joined up in 1898. And that's why I think it's so significant. So the Rebbe Rashab wants to look at the relationship of the erotic encounter and the reproductive encounter. And he argues that so many times we've assumed that it's the man procreates and the woman is a sort of a means to a particular end. If we go back to ancient times with the rights of the father of infanticide, that the child belonged and was seen to belong to the father. And even on a medical, biological level, there were many assumptions that the child was included in the male semen, and the woman was just a mere incubator to bring it out into life. And we see that also in many rabbinic and Hasidic texts too. So the attention to the female role in procreation has been somewhat limited before 1898. And Rebbe Rashab himself talked about it quite extensively the year before at his son's wedding in 1897. But I would say that as a genre, as a sugya, as a topic in Hasidic thought, it's not as well developed as we find in 1898. So Rebbe Rashab argues that really the act of creation and reproduction is mainly by the woman, rather than the man sort of being the the source, the reason, the means by which a child can be born. And we're talking about the birds and the bees over here. But obviously we understand that, and the Rebbe Shab will get onto the function of the father in reproduction. But for the Rebbe Shab, he sees that the mother is the true source of the child. And with this, he draws from Gemaras and different sources. And in this way, the question then becomes, if a woman is so reproductive, if a woman is so fertile that she's able to produce a child, why does she need a husband? Why does she need a partner? Why does she need a father for this child? Why can't she just reproduce herself? And this is where we sort of see a parallel with this idea of the letters and the bricks and the body as these sort of essential qualities that don't have any motivation to activate. They don't activate themselves because they are comfortable in who they are. That's what it means to be an essential thing. And so we identify this with the role of being a makabel, being a recipient. Now, oftentimes we think that if you need to receive, that means you're lacking in something. But maybe the reason why you're receiving is because someone wants to give you something. You're happy they can give, they can give, they don't have to give. They're just as happy if you don't give. The recipient is only in the role of the recipient is because someone wants to give them something, but not because they're lacking anything or they're not aware of any lack. And the importance of recognizing how the woman is, through her sort of role in the sexual act as the recipient of the male semen, forgive me for being crude, her positionality in the sexual act as such as the recipient of the male ejaculation and the male semen positions her as the makabel. And just like we saw in speech, that needs to be makabel from the consciousness to have anything meaningful to say. And just like the body needs to have the soul to enliven it and to make it functional, so too the woman needs to have the man who's going to come along and trigger and sort of provoke her into her and reveal to her procreative capacity. What's so important to the Rebbe Shab in all of these instances is not to just invert the hierarchy, because all you're just then doing is doing the same thing backwards. It doesn't have any concept. It's not really a very
it's replacing one hierarchy with another.
Yeah, it's not an impressive act. What we're doing over here is, I like to call it, we're perverting the hierarchy, leaving everything positionally where it always was, but completely changing their values. And what happens is the man, by dint of being in relationship with the woman, also becomes procreative. His capacity to recreate himself, because the act of recreation is a sort of a real communication of essence. It's not really when you're communicating an idea. The child that is born is going to have similar genetic structure as you. So you're really reproducing yourself as you are in your very core of yourself. So for a man to be able to be blessed with this capacity, it's purely because of his relationship with her, or even the existence of women. The existence of women is the causality of why there are men. Maternity breeds paternity. And similarly, the reason why there is a soul is because of the body. The reason why there is consciousness is because of speech. But all of these makablim, all of these recipients are so profound in their articulation of something truly essential that these otherwise expressive components, such as consciousness, such as men, such as souls, they want to have a piece of that pie. They want to have a connection to that. They want to relate to that. And in fact, they're necessary, because otherwise the whole loop would not be filled. So everyone has a part to play. But whereas historically we would have privileged the male role, the consciousness role, and the soul role, what comes as a result, the impact of the essays and the sermons of 1898, is that all of a sudden we have a new sense of importance and prominence and significance to speech, to bodies, and to women.
This is, of course, shall we say, surprising to a certain degree. And you in your book have linked this to certain later developments in mid to late 20th century philosophy. And you brought up three fairly important names in the post-war French, one might say, postmodern or deconstructionist school of philosophical thought, namely Emmanuel Levinas, who was also an important Jewish and somewhat rabbinic thinker, Jacques Derrida, and Kristeva. Could you perhaps give us an idea? I mean, obviously these three are thinkers or worlds unto themselves, but to what degree did the ideas of these lectures prefigure and intersect with the worldviews of these thinkers? Why do you bring them into conversation with each other?
So I want to make clear that I am making no claim of some intellectual genesis of the ideas in what we might call postmodernism, poststructuralism, deconstructionism. Any name I would give any of those three characters, they'd probably disapprove of. So let's just leave them as they are.
Right. It's a bit too much to ask to think that Derrida was sitting down and reading the Rebbe the Rashab's Ma'amarim. That I think is a bridge slightly too far. Yes.
It's not only do I not say that, I don't really want to say that, and I don't even think that would be an interesting thing to say. I think the interesting feature is that we can find in the structure of the Rebbe Rashab's argument, as well as in the particular details of his argument, a foretaste of what is going to be developed independently in these three thinkers. I could have chosen others. I don't think that it's exclusively about them. I thought they were the low-lying fruit, maybe call it that. It would be easier to work with, and I already had some familiarity with them. But I do think it can be expressed more widely. And I think it's critical to really appreciate something at its most core fundamental level. Sometimes there needs to be this reconsideration of the component parts that are concealing it or that are attempting to express it. Taking a step back and saying, okay, societally, we've got these dualisms that have lasted for thousands of years. Our Greek inheritance has told us that we should be thinking about these things in this particular fashion. And there's been a whole range of reconfigurations over the years, even way into the Enlightenment and even into the early 20th century in philosophy of mind, if you want to take that example. But still, we're sort of stuck in pretty much the same paradigm. And what it all leads back to is a primacy and a starting point of all discussion from rational consciousness. And that is, even if you want to get into sort of more empiricist approaches and phenomenological approaches, there's still a thetic consciousnness that is going to inform the actions and the performance and the interactions with people. So if we're going to talk about speech acts, speech acts are intentional speech acts. It's very rare, even if we want to create a sort of a more of a level playing field and appreciate speech or appreciate women or appreciate bodies. We sort of oftentimes will then elevate them, supposedly, to the level of the previous sort of superior quality. So we dissolve the differences, and then we sort of say that it's a form of consciousness. It's so special. It's just as special as consciousness, and so it remains this stuck in this mode. And I think, Levinas, I think, is so important in rejecting this form of thinking and recognizing there's an ethics that precedes philosophy, that constitutes philosophy, that allows philosophy to happen, and embracing this, what he calls the idea of infinity, which he takes from Descartes, to allow the possibility of a new thinking, of a new way of consciousness. And similarly, we see in the feminist thought and the more gendered thinking is to not so much to sort of dissolve the differences between male and female, which was definitely the attempt by some feminist thinkers in the 20th century, but to really rethink what it might mean to be a recipient, what it might mean to play that role in the sexual encounter. What does that inform us for a new thinking about gender difference and gender influence and intersubjectivity? So, I think the intersubjectivity of it all is seeing the reconstituting how the subjects are reconstituted in this new thinking. And I think that Levinas, Derrida, and Kristeva do it all in slightly different ways, but I do see an intellectual continuity in their projects, which is able to be in conversation with, be informed by, and also provide a different form or a different frame of reference to appreciate the Rebbe Rashab as well. So I just feel like it could be such a fruitful and intellectually rich encounter. Seemingly they're working in very different and with very clearly different agendas. Maybe their motivations for writing, their motivations for speaking, but I don't see why that should preclude the possibility of them finding each other interesting.
Even though, of course, it is important to emphasize how different some of the outcomes were, because, of course, certainly Derrida and Kristeva were at the forefront of a revolution, a conceptual revolution, I suppose, that was tied up with the sexual and feminist revolutions in the 60s, 70s, 80s when they were very active. And of course, how you presented the ideas of the Rebbe the Rashab certainly does complicate or recalibrate the relationship between men and women. But of course, the essential position that he retains is the one of traditional Hasidic understanding of the place of a woman or the role of a woman, or understanding that women have something like a traditional place within the society. In other words, even if the hierarchy may be inverted or may be entirely different to how we imagine it, what I'm trying to say is there are notable differences in practical outcome, even if the philosophical journeys do have intriguing parallels. I mean, I phrased this as a statement, but the question would be, surely that would be the case.
Well, I think we have to start maybe. So often we find that our perception of the present colors our perception of the past, and I don't know if it is necessarily obvious that gender relationships in late 19th century Europe were as patriarchal and unbalanced as we might want to portray them, or that today is as liberated and as egalitarian as some people might hope for. So I think we should just be a bit more open about. I mean, again, here we're going away from the idea of the realm of ideas to the realm of the social fabric, and social fabrics are sort of take time to evolve and develop. And I do think that the Rebbe Rashab's framing of these ideas are the beginning of a change in trajectory for women's roles and their positioning, their situatedness within Hasidic life that began to develop in the early 20th century and then flourished to a greater extent in later 20th century. So I think the social impact of these ideas are still quite significant. And they didn't just stay in the realm of conceptual thought. Now, and similarly, I think that when we look at Derrida or Kristeva, I think there's a large misunderstanding about what they want to do and what they're trying to achieve. I think this idea of inverting the hierarchy is a very dominant narrative in popular and also sometimes in academic talk about their works. And I think it really does miss what they're doing by reframing forms of intersubjectivity. So oftentimes you'll hear, relativism, it all just means that everything's nonsense, nothing makes any sense, and nothing's true anymore. And it sort of diminishes. It's always seen as I think I wrote in the book, that people perceive as deconstruction as being unconstructive. And sort of what is the point of, destroying all forms of certainty and truth? It's helpful. I think that is a very superficial and crass appreciation of what they're doing intellectually and what they're capable of doing socially as well. I think the bringing in of a certain fluidity into the ideas and removing the hierarchical structures, but then sort of rethinking them. I think I talk about how Derrida talks about this sort of second move, this sort of biphasic movement where he then reconstitutes consciousness. He reconstitutes, similar to the way the Rebbe Rashab does, that the man doesn't all of a sudden become a nobody, a useless tool anymore because we no longer have a gender hierarchy. The male functionality just changes. And in many ways becomes enhanced. It becomes developed. And so we're still left with the same world and with the same structures that existed before, but they can be completely raided of their previous sort of potency. And now we have a whole new infrastructure in place. And I think that you definitely see this in Kristeva, where she most pointedly does not go along the lines of other feminist thinkers and does seriously engage with the value and the importance and the male contribution particularly to maternity And so I'm just a bit more gentle about the sharp edges of that question. I don't deny that might be what's surprising to people, that these people could have like a meaningful conversation about the points. But I think that's also what's fascinating about ideas in general, and it's necessary to also think through how these ideas apply. But an idea is not something that is so limited and confined that it can only bring about to one outcome. In the speaking of, the Rebbe Rashab spoke these ideas. Levinas, Derrida, and Christeva spoke these ideas. And in a way, that generated new ideas, different applications. In many ways, I don't think it undermines the point, it only accentuates it.
Interesting. I'm afraid our time is running a little short, so we may have to have a pause there, except for one final question, which I'd like to ask. I asked many of my guests, which is as follows. If you had the opportunity to sit down this evening to dinner with the Rebbe, the Rashab, or I don't know, maybe sit next to him at a Farbrengen or something, and had a few minutes audience with him, what would you be asking him? What would you want to know? Are there points you wish to clarify? If you had that opportunity, how would that go about? How would that go down?
I should have listened to some of your previous episodes, so I knew that question was coming.
Just off the top of your head, what is? I must clarify with him this, or I must get his wisdom on that.
Can it be of nothing to do with the subject, or a different area of his thought?
Sure.
So the Rebbe Rashab is one of the things he does very well is he brings examples from everyday life and understanding, and sort of articulates how that fits into sort of the more metaphysical, ontological themes. And in one place, he sort of draws out the difference between seeing a beautiful picture and hearing sweet music, or a very beautiful music, a beautiful painting. So he's trying to differentiate between the experience of perception through sight and perception through hearing. He says that when a person sees a beautiful painting, they're drawn to it to the point where they can't pull themselves away from it. It captivates them in a way that none of the other senses can achieve. However, at the same time, when a person hears beautiful music, it can lead them to a point of absolute elation and ecstasy.
This has been the podcast of Jewish Ideas by Torah in Motion, produced by Alicia Kelman and myself, JJ Kimchi.
And I would just love
edited
to hear
and mixed by Alicia Kelman. You can stay up to date by subscribing to your favorite podcast app.
Doesn't it work
Support
both
more
ways?
thoughtful Jewish
But
content like this.
particular
Please
problem
visit
I'm working through at the moment
torahinmotion.org/donate.
philosophy of perception, and the primacy that, again, you'll get the sense of sort of my intellectual world. It's sort of, there becomes a certain hierarchy in dualism between seeing and hearing. Ein doim mashmi'a l're'ir, right? And I'm trying to think through that idea, and he gives these beautiful examples, which are so human and so relatable. At the same time, I don't know if that is my experience of them. I just feel like he has such a rich human experience that he draws from. And if I could just sort of hear more of that richness, I think my appreciation of his mashalim, his examples that he gives to get into a theme, would be immensely enhanced. But I would probably be too shy and overawed by the experience. And if I was sensible, just stay quiet and listen.
Exactly. There's a big difference between what you would like in theory to ask and what is likely to actually happen, whether that's ever happen. Okay, Dr. Reuven Leigh, this was a wonderful and fascinating conversation on the Rebbe the Rashab. Thank you so much. We thoroughly enjoyed it. And I recommend to our audience to pick up a copy of your book. They can find it and delve more into this fascinating topic. We are very grateful that you joined us today on the podcast of Jewish Ideas.
Thank you so much for having me.